For more on today's top political stories, let's bring in Catherine Lucey and Sarah Westwood. Catherine is a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Sarah is a political and investigative reporter for the Washington Examiner. Welcome. It's good to have you both. Catherine, let me start with you. Consumer prices just made their biggest jump in over 30 years. How does the president's message about inflation this morning differ from what the White House had been saying about it these past few weeks?
Well, that's right. This was a big jump. The president really was signaling a lot of urgency today, as he said that he needs to address this. The White House is concerned about it. Now, the inflation has been rising, as you know, for some time, and people have been worried about this for months. In recent months, the White House has acknowledged these pressures, but has often pointed to the data and research that shows that they expect this to come down, that they expect this to be temporary. And they have consistently tried to point to a lot of other economic indicators, which are strong when you look at things like hiring, when you look at things like wages. But what they're really contending with now, and I think the president acknowledged this today, is that while other areas of the economy are strong and other indicators are strong, people feel unstable. People feel really worried about how they are doing, where this is going. They're worried about pricing. You're going to see increased anxiety, perhaps heading into the holidays as people buy, Thanksgiving food, as they shop for presents. This is going to be a continued theme. And so I think you're going to see the White House really push to try and show that they are working to address this, try and show that they are working on it. But another thing to look at as we head into the next couple of weeks is that we're in a real crunch moment for the second half of the president's legislative agenda. So you have the social spending bill. And one question now is, will anxieties around inflation or some of these issues put more pressure on that? You saw, Senator Joe Manchin, a key, Democratic vote in the Senate, express concern again today about inflation. And he's been somebody who has raised concerns about this, consistently in the past.
And on those bills, Sarah, how might one explain the disconnect of a president pitching bills with high public support to his sinking approval ratings?
Well, I think President Biden really hasn't done a good job, and neither have Democrats writ large, of explaining to the American people what these bills are going to do for them and their families. They've not done a good job of explaining why bills of this size are necessary, and the economic backdrop for them is just getting worse and worse. It's harder for them to justify infusing so much money into the economy after really doing it twice already this year, first with the American Rescue Plan, then with the massive infrastructure bill that just passed Congress that President Biden is preparing to sign. And now they want to do a third infusion of government spending at a time when Americans are starting to really feel the rising cost of living that can arguably be traced back to the timing of these bills and the size of them. President Biden hasn't really created an identity for the massive spending bill other than its price tag. And neither have Democrats, who are still negotiating what will be in and out of the plan. So even though individual pieces of that piece of legislation are popular with people, like the paid family leave piece, for example, the bill itself really has no identity for most people. It would be hard for an average voter to articulate exactly what we're going to get out of this bill. And Biden's inability to articulate that as well, coupled with his inability so far to get it over the finish line, I think is really feeding into this perception that he's not the steady hand at the wheel that voters believed he would be when they put him in the White House.
We'll watch to see how the messaging around that changes. Well, Catherine, it's interesting because we've seen President Biden's approval ratings sink, but Vice President Harris's are even lower. Is that a concern the White House is working to address?
Well, certainly we've seen approval ratings for both the president and the vice president decline. And with the president, that really started over the summer. There were concerns, I think, among the public about the rushed exit from Afghanistan, and then a lot of anxiety and concern around COVID and the economy, to some of what Sarah was just saying. And those things have really taken a toll on the poll numbers. It is very interesting that the vice president's numbers are even lower. And I think that's a real question now for them to answer, why specifically she would be polling, at least in some of these polls, worse than he is. And that raises questions, I think, about her agenda, how visible she is to the public, some of the issues she's been are people, concerned with the issues she's been working on in terms of, the border, some of the issues that have been key issues for her. And I think that's something that we'll see play out in the coming weeks and months. But certainly, I think broadly, the elections last week, the Democratic loss of Virginia, the other races around the country have been something of a wake-up call for Democrats as they look ahead to the midterms, and the president's approval ratings play into Democratic anxiety about next year. And that's really why you're seeing a lot of urgency and action around the president's agenda. And additionally, I think efforts to explain the president's agenda, as Sarah was just talking about, as they try and pivot to a message in terms of what they are getting done and explaining what they are getting done ahead of the midterm elections.
Well, Sarah, switching gears, a new Politico morning consult poll finds that 55% of those polled support requiring all employers with 100 or more workers to mandate COVID-19 vaccination or testing. Despite the courts halting the White House's mandate, the White House is pressing on. So where do things stand?
Well, I think it's interesting. Those poll numbers suggest right now support for a hypothetical vaccine mandate, right? Because it hasn't gone into effect and the potential consequences of that mandate aren't being felt yet. I will be interested to see if this mandate is allowed to proceed by the courts, how those numbers will shift if industries experience labor shortages that really cut back on services that are already strained right now. For example, if in the trucking industry, in the shipping industry, if the vaccine mandate costs a lot of jobs and people start feeling the pinch from that, if they'll continue to support the mandate at the same levels. Where we've seen vaccine mandates implemented on an individual basis so far, such as in certain states' healthcare industries or in specific corporations, we have seen people are willing to lose their jobs rather than take the vaccine in ways that can actually impact the way those organizations or those industries run. Now, that's the political risk that the Biden administration is facing in pushing a vaccine mandate when the majority of American adults are already vaccinated at this point. And the court case is coming down to whether OSHA has the authority, the Labor Department has the authority to enforce what is essentially a public health regulation here to be vaccinated in the workplace. Both sides are really arguing about what the scope of OSHA's purview is when it comes to this sort of thing. And the courts right now are potentially going to redefine the kind of power that OSHA has, whether they hem it in or they broaden it a little bit. The decision will have a lot of implications for, I think, what the Labor Department can do.
On the foreign policy front, Catherine, the White House announced President Biden will be meeting with the leaders of Mexico and Canada next week. What is on the agenda?
Yes, that's right. That is a White House meeting coming up. The president has had virtual interactions, but this will be the first in-person meeting of all three of these leaders. The White House says some of the key topics they'll address will be the pandemic, climate change, other areas of collaboration. But broadly, I think some of this also is aimed at sort of strengthening ties and promoting ties between these three countries. This obviously comes, as you know, Elaine, after a stretch where some of those bonds were frayed under President Trump, who clashed with Canada over tariffs, tensions with Mexico over his border wall. So I think you will see President Biden really try and stress the ways that he wants to collaborate with those two leaders.
Well, Sarah, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell recently discussed how infrastructure is the only positive development for the Senate, something that he crossed party lines to do. What is happening to Republicans on the House side who crossed the aisle to vote for the infrastructure bill?
They are certainly facing the vitriol of a lot of Trump supporters, further right Republicans right now, who are really unhappy that they helped deliver what is essentially an unqualified win for the Biden administration. And I think there's a lot of rank and file Republicans in the House in particular who are a little frustrated that that was how the bill got over the finish line as well, because progressives and other Democrats weren't really willing to get out of their own way and allow that to pass in a timely fashion. And Republicans sort of helped Democrats win something that a lot of other more mainstream establishment Republicans would probably rather have seen Democrats not succeed at doing. Now, wanting to sort of purge Republicans from the party that were seen as insufficiently conservative or insufficiently loyal to Trumpism, for example, is not new. We've seen it going all the way back to the Tea Party when there was these revolts against establishment Republicans who were perceived as being insufficiently committed to what was really driving the base at that time. And I think that some of those members who did vote for the infrastructure bill are going to have a hard time in the midterms. That's not something that primary opponents are going to forget. That could even potentially create an opening for a primary opponent for some of these more vulnerable members, some whose districts have, for example, trended more red in recent years. They might face some pressure over this.
All right, something to keep an eye on. Catherine Lucey and Sarah Westwood, thank you both very much.